After the age of St. Augustine, intellectual life in Western Europe entered a long period of decline. Between roughly the 400s and the 700s, the western half of the former Roman Empire experienced what historians have traditionally described as a culturally bleak or dark age. This decline was not the result of a sudden loss of intelligence or curiosity among the population. Rather, it was caused by the collapse of the political, economic, and social institutions that had once sustained learning, education, and cultural continuity. At the heart of this transformation was the decline of cities. Under Roman rule, cities had been the backbone of Western civilization. They were centers of administration, law, education, commerce, and culture. When imperial authority vanished in the West, cities rapidly shrank. Population numbers plummeted as trade dried up, taxes went uncollected, and public services ceased to function. Urban centers also became prime targets for Germanic raids, since wealth was concentrated there. Civil wars, banditry, and constant insecurity further isolated cities from one another, breaking down the networks that sustained economic and intellectual life. As the urban world collapsed, many city dwellers fled to the countryside. Some became subsistence farmers, others sought refuge in monasteries, which offered stability, food, and protection. This shift away from city life had enormous consequences for education. Roman schools of rhetoric, law, and philosophy had always depended on urban settings, on teachers, students, libraries, and patronage. When cities declined, these schools disappeared as well. Educated individuals did not vanish entirely, but they became increasingly isolated. Learned men lived on rural estates or in monasteries, cut off from vibrant intellectual communities. Without regular teaching, debate, or institutional support, intellectual life dwindled to a bare minimum. Some learning survived into the 500s and 600s, but its scope steadily narrowed, and the transmission of knowledge grew increasingly fragile. One of the most striking signs of intellectual decline in the West was the disappearance of Greek learning. During the height of the Roman Empire, educated elites were bilingual. Greek was the language of philosophy and science, while Latin dominated law and administration. By the 4th century, however, Greek literacy was already fading in the western provinces. Even Augustine, one of the most brilliant minds of late antiquity, had only a rudimentary knowledge of Greek. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, contact with the Greek-speaking East collapsed almost entirely. Between the years 400 and 1400, historians can identify only about 6 Western intellectuals who could read Greek. As a result, the vast majority of Greek philosophy, science, and literature became inaccessible. Western scholars had to rely on a handful of incomplete Latin translations. Of Plato's 26 major works, for example, only one was available in Latin throughout most of the Middle Ages. Medieval thinkers were painfully aware that the intellectual inheritance of Greece and Rome was slipping away, but they lacked both the linguistic skills and the institutional resources to retrieve it. One figure stands out as a final bridge between the classical world and the medieval West, Boethius. Born around 480 into an old Roman aristocratic family, Boethius was educated in both Greek and Latin and served as a high-ranking official under the Ostrogothic king of Italy. He was deeply committed to preserving ancient learning and envisioned an ambitious plan to translate all of the works of Plato and Aristotle into Latin. This project, however, was never completed. Boethius was arrested and executed for political reasons around 524. Before his death, he managed to translate only 2 short works of Aristotle, both dealing with logic. Despite their modest size, these texts became enormously influential. For centuries, they were virtually the only writings of Aristotle available in Western Europe. Because of this, Boethius is often called the last of the Romans, and at the same time, the first of the scholastics, the final major classical intellectual before a long silence and the starting point for medieval philosophical tradition. While figures like Boethius preserved scraps of classical learning, the long-term survival of ancient texts depended largely on monasteries. In this context, the influence of Saint Benedict of Nursia was decisive. Born into a wealthy Roman family around 480, Benedict abandoned public life to become a hermit and later founded a monastery at Monte Cassino in central Italy. There he wrote the Rule of Saint Benedict, which regulated monastic life and was eventually adopted throughout Western Europe. One of the core principles of Benedict's rule was that monks must remain constantly occupied. Idleness, Benedict believed, led to sin. Among the daily tasks assigned to monks was the copying of manuscripts. This labor, tedious and time-consuming, became one of the most important mechanisms for preserving ancient literature. Benedictine monks copied religious texts, grammatical manuals, classical authors, and philosophical summaries by hand, generation after generation. Because time and resources were limited, monks naturally focused on practical or abbreviated works, textbooks, commentaries, and summaries, rather than complex philosophical treatises. As a result, while monasteries preserved a thin thread of classical culture, they could not sustain deep or original intellectual inquiry. Monks spent far more time copying texts than analyzing or expanding upon them. Intellectual life survived, but in a narrow and constrained form. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, therefore, represented far more than a political transition. It marked a profound rupture in intellectual history. Much of the accumulated knowledge of Greece and Rome was lost, forgotten, or reduced to fragments. Medieval scholars often knew less about the ancient world than modern students do today. Even the ideas that survived were transformed by centuries of Christian theological reflection and by the influence of Neoplatonism. By the early Middle Ages, Western Europe had entered a new cultural and intellectual era, one shaped by monasticism, Christian theology, and the memory, rather than the reality, of classical civilization. The ancient world had not vanished completely, but its legacy endured only in fragile echoes, waiting to be rediscovered centuries later.